When I heard about this book coming out, I was like, oh, here we go. Were you aware of like how easy it would be to fall into just hit piece territory on something like this?
I know that there's sort of a disposition to be a little alarmist when it comes to gambling, and we've heard those stories a million times, and I was trying to go beyond that.
Okay, welcome back to another edition of the Business of Betting podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Edelstein, senior analyst with ingame.com. I'm joined today by Danny Funt, the author of Everybody Loses. There's a lot of words here I got to get through. It's Everybody Loses, a tumultuous rise of American sports gambling. It's a lot of words for a title.
Yeah, I'm still struggling to spell tumultuous.
That's a tough one. Yeah, guarantee is my bane of existence. I can't get guarantee right no matter how much I try. So yeah, tumultuous is up there. That could create some havoc. So I want to start by saying this. If you Google this book, these are some of the news headlines that pop up in reviews and conversations. Why sports betting should concern Christians. That's from the Gospel Coalition. Vanity Fair, sports betting sites make it all too easy to lose everything you've got. Bloomberg, sports betting, blurring the lines between gaming, gambling, New Yorker, how betting took over sports, on and on and on. And so to an average person, and I'll put myself in that category, when I heard about this book coming out, I was like, oh, here we go. As I referred to it in my review of this, half-assed hit piece on the industry, looking forward to destroying it. I read it. I'm like, well, shit, this is a really good book. Not at all a half-assed hit piece. We're going to talk about it, some of the nuts and bolts to it. But just right off the bat, let me ask you, were you aware of like how easy it would be to fall into just hit piece territory on something like this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I read all the same stuff you do. I know that there's sort of a disposition to be a little alarmist in certain mainstream media when it comes to gambling. And sometimes there's low-hanging fruit that they latch onto that's, we've heard those stories a million times. And I was trying to go beyond that. I wanted it to be fair and share a lot of perspectives. That's why I wanted to speak with hundreds of people for this book. Telling it through one person's eyes was just, what a waste considering there's so many stakeholders in this. And also I know, from covering this for several years before writing the book, mainly for the Washington Post, gotten plenty of feedback from people who don't like certain tropes trotted out again and again, and just wanted to be careful because in addition to telling, what I hope is an interesting story for right now, I wanted it to be in an ideal world, kind of the decisive telling of what's happened with the betting boom in sports. So yeah, wanted to be fair and measured in how I did that.
I don't want to say the first half, but the first third of the book was just awesome. I love when I'm interested in something and I think I know everything about it. And then I read something and I'm like, well, I didn't know that. That's surprising. And I don't have anything in particular to point to that, but I kept coming back to that feeling like, oh, wow, I didn't necessarily realize this. So the first third of the book really is like a history of gambling, concentrating mostly like in the last like 15, 20 years. But you go back to the 1600s and like lotteries and stuff, which is a lot of fun. When you set out to write this book, was that the idea from the jump that you wanted to delve all the way back into the history of all this and to really set the stage for what was to come?
Not really. I did want to give context to this profound change of heart that the sports leagues and their broadcasting partners and politicians had. In order to understand the tone they've struck now, you'd want to know the things they were saying in the past. I was hopeful that I could kind of breeze through that and it wouldn't feel like sort of eating your vegetables before getting to the good stuff. But as I started learning about, the past century of gambling and sports, it was just too interesting to give it short shrift. So I liked writing it, and I'm really happy to hear you liked reading it too.
Oh, I absolutely. I think I wrote something that it had the, locomotive like narrative, and I felt like I was like reading a treatment to like the movie that this might one day be, right?
Yeah, that was our goal too for the whole thing, was to keep it entertaining and keep it moving and not kind of have details that, you'd expect in a history textbook or, something that's just trying to overwhelm you with factoids. There was a couple good examples of that where my editor was like, this has to go. And I'm like, man, this is great find I had. You're killing me. But he just was militant about keeping it brisk. So I like that when I'm reading books too. I'm grateful ultimately that he had that perspective.
Oh, well, now I got to ask, what are some of those finds that didn't make the cut?
One that he cut outright was, I talk about, Adam Silver taking over for David Stern and writing that op-ed in the New York Times that broke from this very aggressively anti-gambling posture that Stern had. and how Chris Christie had run-ins with David Stern where he just blew his head off for trying to get legal gambling in New Jersey. And there was a scene from, I'm forgetting what they call it. Some people call it like Billionaires Summer Camp. It's this event in Idaho, I think. Does that ring a bell?
I'm going to get it conflated with something on Succession, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's straight out of that. It's basically like the heads of all these companies and sports leagues and whatever gather in Idaho. And David Stern was there, Christie was there, and Bill Bradley was there, who was working for a consulting firm after retiring from the Senate. And there was this scene where they're at dinner and Stern and Bradley confront Christie and just start yelling at him, tearing into him for what he was doing to overturn PASPA. And Adam Silver is just like watching from a distance and not getting involved. And I was like, oh, that's illustrative, kind of how all these people view things. And my editor was like, it feels like just something you're excited that you gathered as a reporting scoop, but it doesn't really advance things. Wait, we get that this is where all these people stood on this issue. So let's move on. So that's just a taste for you.
As someone who, I used to cover the governor, and I know him relatively well. I've spoken to him a bunch of times. He's a personality. I would have loved to see him on the receiving end.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for real.
That's something you don't see every day. Reading the book, a lot of the interviews, I've spoken with many of the same people. You got some great quotes out of a lot of people. I'm like, man, why don't they ever tell me this shit? Did you get pushback from anyone?
Well, to start, FanDuel and DraftKings didn't cooperate. The heads of the leagues, maybe this was delusional. I thought I'd get the commissioners on the phone or a face-to-face. No luck. So that count as pushback. When I sent them this long memo of fact-checking queries, I expected, page after page of rebuttal. Didn't get that either. I quote a few things that they said of, clarifying their stance on one issue or another, but not really much. That said, I definitely had some intense conversations with people, who were very defensive of the industry or the league's stance on the industry. So it wasn't all people just spilling their hearts about everything they see wrong with what's happening.
When did you start covering this kind of stuff for the Post? Like post-PASPA or before then?
Yeah, the first thing I ever wrote about sports betting, I think, was 2021. So I guess I'm a relative newcomer. I'll own that.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned in the book that you've been a sports fan and you've bet in your life, and you bet today or no?
I've chilled out for like the past year. It's partly because I had a kid a year ago and money's tight and counting my pennies. It also had something to do with, I felt like just hearing from so many people that I don't stand a chance at winning. Eventually that sinks in, even if you're, delusional enough to be betting in the first place. But I was living in New York when they legalized, like everyone else, couldn't resist, all the new customer promotions. I'd bet a few times out in Vegas before then. So I dabble, that's for sure.
The second half of the book, or like the latter 2/3 of the book, went chapter by chapter, diving into plenty of topics that I've written about myself, saying that, there's some issues perhaps with VIPs. There's some issue with advertising. There's some, and we can definitely like make those arguments and they don't fall on deaf ears. And again, I feel like you presented them relatively fairly. I guess my pushback to it, and obviously this is, in the end, this is, a 300 and odd page opinion, reported column, more or less. But do you feel like, as I said in my review of it, again, most people aren't VIPs and don't have to worry about like the come-ons. Most people aren't losing their mortgage. Most people can gamble within their means, and on and on and on. Obviously, there are outliers. There are people that can't handle it. So, to that, like, what do you say to that complaint, I guess, of mine, saying that, like, yeah, okay, I agree. There are some aspects of this that are a little slimy, that are a little ugly. But at the end of the day, for 95% or more people that engage in this is a fun, harmless activity.
I get that. And at the top of our conversation, we were talking about tropes, that you want to avoid. Sometimes I think professional bettors and people with addiction are overrepresented in coverage. They have important, or insightful things to say, so that's fair. But sometimes I'll watch a documentary, something that's like all I heard from were sharps and people with gambling problems. And there's obviously a vast middle that's neglected. So I'm conscientious of that. I think part of it is just the guy who bets $20 a few times a year on football isn't the most interesting person to tell their story. And also, like with VIP, if that's generating more than half of the revenue for these companies, I think it's a pretty big story, even if it's a sliver of customers. And it gets into, I'm always interested in stories that don't have there are things I think that are pretty black and white in the book, but that things that genuinely feel like legitimate ethical or decision-making conflicts. And I think that that's really poignant with how the VIP business is conducted. I can totally sympathize with hosts who feel pulled in multiple directions. So stuff like that I found very interesting. And then, about like a lot of people can do this and they're fine, fair. But I do think it's changing how people engage with sports, even if they don't have a problem. That's noteworthy. I think there's some research that indicates interesting findings about people's betting behaviors and how it affects, their personal finances, things like that are beyond people with a clinically diagnosable gambling problem. So that broadens the pool a bit. But it's a valid point. I get it. Mainly, I think comes down to just what I think is the most important story to tell.
I get that. When it comes to like legalized gambling, I mean, we're living in a world at a time where, beyond sports betting, there's iCasino, sweepstakes sites, prediction markets, with kids, loot boxes, little Lego bags that you don't know what's going to be inside when you open them. We are definitely headed, well, we definitely have gamblified like most of the culture. And sports betting almost feels like, compared to what's out there today, the legalization of sports betting, 7 years ago seems almost quaint in comparison. Do you see sports betting as like the canary in the coal mine? Do you see sports betting as a symptom of a larger issue? Do you see it completely siloed from all this stuff? Like if you had to, if you had to nail you down on that.
I think it's a big deal on its own just because it takes something that people were interested in beyond gambling and adds this huge gambling component to it. Like online casino is a big part of the story potentially, but it's purely gambling. No one was playing blackjack recreationally and now they can risk money on it. The fact that it's introduced that to sports, I think is significant. Also with kids, I hate to even like pretend to have any expertise on this, but certain psychologists and gambling counselors and those people who are really studying this tell me that when kids get caught up with all sorts of gambling, whether, as you said, loot boxes, finding ways to bet on casino type games online, what have you, often they start with sports just because they're sports fans already and they're seeing all their sports heroes promoting gambling. So that feels exceptional about sports. But I don't know, that some of that's just beyond me. I touched on it a little in the last chapter, like how could you not? But I didn't want to get in over my head about the scope of the book just because the sports story on its own felt, daunting enough to try to get right.
The kid thing that you just brought up is interesting. I'm actually working on a piece right now. Common Sense Media released a study last week that said 36% of boys 11 to 17 are gambling. And this raised every alarm, to the Today Show was covering it. Lawmakers saying something must be done in all capital letters. I'm like, man, I guess that's high. And then I started thinking back to my misspent youth, which predated the internet by too many years to count, where freshman year in high school, I'm playing fantasy football. I'm betting on football. I'm a bookie by junior year. We're playing poker every Friday night. So I just kind of think when it comes to that, like the delivery method has changed. But, there was no historical data in that Common Sense Media study that said it's gone up 100% or whatever,
Compared to what? Yeah. And what were they? I don't know. I don't want to critique it without knowing, but like if there is a $10 buy-in to your season-long fantasy league, did that count toward that number? I don't know. I'd hope not. Because that definitely does not strike me or people who do it as gambling.
But I mean, marijuana was once considered the gateway drug to heroin too, right? In the literature, right? So yeah, I don't, what we consider gambling, but and again, I get fed up about this because I did a story once, something like, over 5% of Americans have confirmed, I forget what they call it, but it's a shopping disorder where they can't control their, but like no one is like pushing for Macy's to have a disclaimer on their website saying, if you're spending too much money, on slacks, here's a number to call. And so I do feel some of it is, I don't want to say disingenuous, because obviously problem gambling for some people is a major, it's a life-destroying issue. I'm not trying to discount that. But I feel like it's that we have siloed it a little bit and like pointed it out so specifically. Again, when I go to McDonald's, I get a 20-piece McNugget. I don't have to sign a waiver,
Yeah, this sort of responsibility of the operator, like things like affordability checks, you could ask, why is there no equivalent of this in shopping or buying a car, or whatever. And by the way, I once heard about this like personal shopper at one of those big department stores in London, and that sounded almost identical to the VIP side of the sports betting business. The white glove treatment that people get if they're binge shopping at Harrods or whatever is Sounds a lot like what FanDuel does with VIP bettors. I guess some of that like undeniably does feel like it's trending upward in a alarming direction. Like a stat I cite about often is I live in North Carolina. Half of the calls now to the problem gambling hotline are coming from parents who are concerned about gambling that they're seeing in their students, in their kids. And just talking to a lot of professors, whether they're, involved in gambling or not, what they describe of how their students are like totally preoccupied with gambling does feel different. I don't remember anything at that level when I was in college or younger. So I don't think that's hysterical.
To be fair, I do think we are my son's 16, not a gambler, not really a sports fan, but he has mentioned, he's like, yeah, what's this Kalshi thing all about? Because he's like getting fed, on his Instagram feed, right? I've sat him down. I said, well, a few beers won't kill you, but, everything in moderation. Well, a little bit of weed's not going to kill you, but, anything else is really might. And then when it came time for the gambling conversation, and I am a gambler, I said, don't bother. Let's not. I do get it. And I do think that we're kind of losing a generation of boys, I guess. So again, when I was a kid, gambling was underground. Even, betting with my friend, getting a bookie, playing poker, like these were not things that were broadcast on ESPN. This was still underground. It still felt like you were getting away with something, maybe, a little bit seedy. Today, obviously not the case. It's as American as, Chevrolet and apple pie. And, we're not doing a very good job of explaining to kids the risks, much like we do a half decent job with booze and sex and drugs. I think right now, Virginia is the only state that mandates education, like in school. New Jersey, I think, has a law passed, but it's not instilled yet. Other states are looking into it. But yeah, it kind of feels like the same gym teacher that's telling me, to use a condom should be telling me what a parlay is and the risks involved,
Yeah, you'd think. I started one chapter. Do you know Matt Davidow by chance? So for your listeners, very accomplished bettor, particularly on the NFL. And then he was working for this company called Huddle that had acquired a previous company he was working with as an odds provider. And he told me that he sat down his 9-year-old to explain like the basics of the VIG and, why over time you don't really stand a chance at winning money if you're playing at fixed odds. And I just found that interesting. He's so in the weeds of this that he thought kind of had to give the gambling version of the talk to a third grader is such a sign of the times. It does make me think also, like when you were saying, this common sense study maybe could have benefited from historical context to see if this is numbers actually going up. The flip side of that, sometimes where the industry will tout like prevalence of gambling hasn't really spiked the way you might think among adults, at least. But I sometimes wonder if they're thinking like, if they're counting, a Super Bowl squares game at your office or, betting a little money on March Madness compared to what we're seeing now. If that also feels apples to oranges, but in the other direction. So all this stuff feels like worth doing more research on. And I do get into the book a number of people who believe like it's deliberately under-researched. And that was felt like an important takeaway to me was that why is the industry so resistant to devoting more federal and state spending to studying something as basic as is gambling prevalence any different than it was, pre-2018? I find that a little conspicuous.
I suppose, but I mean, I guess on the flip side of it, if I'm running a business that's selling, widgets, I just want people to keep buying my widgets. I don't want to know, if they're buying them for, what I'm saying? Like, so I get why they might not want to do that, but sure. No, I mean, listen, when we turn the page on this in 25, 30 years, we'll know a lot more.
Yeah, but I mean, when you want the headline widget sales way up, I mean, that's typically great advertising. The fact that they don't want that headline, I think maybe is telling.
Okay, that's a fair point. In the research or the writing of the book, was there anything that like genuinely like shocked you? I know, again, you've been covering it for a few years, so maybe not. But was there anything that like you came across and you're like, well, that's really something?
I did not know the extent of VIP perks, and maybe that just makes me out of touch, but obviously knew that that's always been a big part of the gambling business, from casinos on down. I didn't realize the extent of it, and I didn't realize how important the team partnerships are for access to sports-specific VIP perks. When I saw a team say, here's our official sports betting partner, I thought it was just to get the name out and legitimize that company. Not that such a huge motivator is so that VIPs can throw out the first pitch at that team's games, or play on that team's basketball court or give the starting command at that racetrack's NASCAR race. Stuff like that kind of blew me away. The other thing was, I mean, there's a few that were like, again, maybe I'm naive, but genuinely kind of had my jaw dropped. And one was I spoke with so many people who had worked at PointsBet, in part because I used to live in Fort Collins and PointsBet was headquartered in Denver in the US. So a lot of ex PointsBet people out there, and they had just been acquired by Fanatics. So many of them were freed up to talk to me. I heard so many references to their RG department. You know, a marketing person who was, is this commercial acceptable? Let's run it by RG. VIP host who has a client who seems like they're developing a problem, flag that for RG. Trader who's seeing, you know, betting activity that's worrisome, get RG's input. So just even though PointsBet was kind of in that middle tier of operators, they were in 14 states, they did have 1,000 customers. All this made me think the RG desk must have been pretty robust. And then when I finally spoke with this woman, Teresa Fior, who was the RG manager for a couple of years at PointsBet, and I said, okay, just for starters, how big was your team? And feel free to ballpark it because I know it's been a little bit since you worked there. And she said, no need. It was literally just me handling all of American RG for PointsBet. That shocked me. That felt so inadequate. And she said the same.
Yeah, I could see that. So now I'm going to ask you to argue against yourself for a second here. Again, in the research and writing, was there anything that jumped out at you as like, oh, wow, this is pretty cool. This is pretty positive. This is something that they're doing that I get behind, that the industry's doing right, that is, you know, not so terrible. Because you're not calling, to be clear, you're not calling for the end of sports betting.
No. And I honestly, I say this a lot, but I feel like it's such a waste of time to spend a lot of time on to legalize or to go back to prohibition. A, because it seems so unlikely. And B, because there's so much middle, you know, in the middle that's worth, I don't think that's either realistic or productive. Now, I thought, speaking with KindBridge, this telehealth provider, I didn't realize that a number of operators are funding at least introductory counseling sessions for people who self-exclude through those operators. And, you know, it's pretty easy to kind of rig the system and just say, I need help, so I'm going to go self-exclude at FanDuel, then FanDuel will pay for my care. You know, people at KindBridge even said that, you know, that definitely happens. But that made sense. Like, you know, as far as the operators taking some responsibility that, oh, if people developed a problem on our platform, we should help them get better. You could argue that they should be funding a longer, you know, duration of care because just, you know, introductory sessions or your first few weeks of sessions isn't going to get you better. But that seems commendable.
Looking towards the future, like, you know, to borrow a phrase from Bill Simmons, if I made, who took it on the chin in the book, if you were made sports betting czar of America, what would you do? You know, the genie's out of the bottle. It's not going anywhere. So how would you make it better, safer, cleaner?
Yeah, once again, I know this is lame podcasting, but I recoil at that initially. I'll play along, but just it's so antithetical to how I try to behave as a reporter. But I dabble in some of that at the end of the book, so fair enough. I think some of these promotions are totally fair game for further regulation. I particularly just think anything that's remotely in the risk-free language, you know, anything that's suggesting there's no risk of losing your money. This is a can't lose bet. If you call it no sweat or otherwise, it's conveying the exact same thing. That's just so blatantly misleading because obviously you are risking your money. You know, you are sweating if you stand to lose all that money. That feels just totally unnecessary. And it seems like the industry has wisened up to that and been forced to own that thanks to certain states cracking down and even some leagues saying, cut that out. But there's still a lot of no sweat bets out there. And I think that's inappropriate.
No argument for me on that one. Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that they do just, I feel like, just begs for lawmakers getting involved, you know, which honestly kind of brings us to prediction markets because you're not allowed to be on a gambling podcast in 2026 without discussing prediction markets. That's the law. I feel like they're just begging for lawmakers. Like, I mean, some of the stuff that, some of the promotions of the advertising and it's not gambling, but we're gambling. It seems like they are bunch of finance bros who don't understand that you're going to like get caught up in the teeth of the machine at some point.
For sure. Also, it just, as I was reporting the little bit of the book about the DFS boom, this just has so many echoes to me of how DFS have, you know, exploiting a loophole to some extent, being so brazen in how it was advertised, really being deliberately provocative just to get attention in some respects and dealing with the consequences after that. It feels so similar to how this is going now. So I have no basis to say this, but it even feels like sometimes they post markets just to get a rise out of people. Like, again, no reporting here, but if you're have a market on like the transfer portal in college sports, and obviously that was going to have people freaking out of, all the inside information that could be used here, or just why are we betting on people bailing on their programs? That I sometimes see that and I'm like, are they just trying to get like the earned media from that, the free advertising from causing a stir?
It worked. I mean, we actually broke that story, and I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't have the numbers, but I'm relatively certain it was by leaps and bounds our biggest story we've ever published. So, I mean, people know about it. Like they kind of did go from 0 to 60 in the last like 6 months, I think, with just the knowledge of the general public being aware of it. All these deals they're signing with, CNN and Golden Globes, and it's inescapable, which again leads to the, as I was talking about earlier, the gamification of everything.
Do you think, just quickly, I sort of speculated about that one, but it's pretty, in sports, like sometimes I wonder, even when, Polymarket has, markets on like wildfire spreading or, acts of war. Do you think some of that is the same concept? Like it's so provocative and then they'll have to be asked about it and there'll be articles about it and it's just getting the name out there?
I am willing to guess that they're both subscribing to the, the P.T. Barnum school of promotion. Talk good about me, talk bad about me, just keep talking about me, which makes sense. I mean, I get it. But again, it's obviously, it's attracting a lot of unwanted attention also. I guess they think, and, they're clearly betting, pun definitely intended, that current administration / courts / whatever is going to side with them, when push comes to shove, to be determined, obviously. Are you still covering the industry for the Post, or?
Yeah, I mean, the situation there is so sad, and like the way that their sports section's in limbo. And the guy who I had written a lot of these stories for took a buyout and is elsewhere now. But I'm still covering it one way or another for sure. I'm working on a couple stories right now.
Do you see another book down the road on the subject, or will this be the final say for you think?
Maybe. I mean, like, I already am pissed that so much happened between the time we finalized the book and it was published, which is just the nature of book publishing, but there's a lot more to tell. And if what we were talking about earlier, where sports is just the tip of an iceberg, that feels like it's ripe for a book, especially the political stuff. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker a few years ago about Kalshi at the time and this site called Predict It that were mainly political betting. And that felt, again, like you could really make a case for or against that. There's definitely some redeeming value to election markets. I think that would be very interesting for a book if this catches on and that goes from kind of a fringe academic thing to something that a lot of people are risking money on, but we'll see.
Well, I mean, again, like with Predict It and Kalshi in the beginning, and even Polymarket in the beginning, this is a source of truth. We're going to aggregate where people are putting their money, and with the idea being that this is the wisdom of the crowds. And it has, I mean, in very small samples, at least the ones that are publicized, it worked. I mean, they had Trump winning, and on and on. But like clearly with sports, they're going very far away from that. And what will Mr. Beast say on his next video? Obviously there's no economic hedging to be done with this kind of stuff. And so I feel like they're talking out of one side of their mouth and doing some of the other side. But the flip side, I guess the libertarian in me says, oh, listen, if I want to bet on something and there's a market for it, I should be allowed to do it, but we'll see. I don't know where it ends. It's a different looking culture as a result. As you said earlier, how sports betting has changed the nature of fandom. Growing up as a kid, living and breathing and living and dying and, sports. One of my core memories in my life is 1986. I'm a freshman in high school, yet to discover beer or women, one of those things I was wildly successful with following. Game 6, New York Mets, 2 outs, nobody on. I'm 14 years old, sobbing, like bawling. Like, I can't believe my Mets are going to lose the World Series, And now, fast forward, 40 years, 30 years, whatever. But like, you don't have to go that far. Fast forward a few years after that, I would have sold the Mets down the river for $5, So it definitely does change the way we interact with sports.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I wrestle with that. I purposely chose to not let it dominate the book, because I think it can be such a turnoff to some people. It's that same libertarian principle of like, it's my money. Don't judge me or wag your finger at me, but how I want to spend it. As I said, personally, I feel iffy about that and how I want to engage with sports and whether I want gambling to kind of dominate my experience watching a game. I'm on the fence about, but I just felt like the story of how the business is being conducted and taking shape was so much more compelling, and like so many more people could be unified in maybe taking issue with that, that just felt like the better book to me. But no doubt that stuff weighs on me. And I think about like the equivalent of that world's, that game 6 for me. And like, I think it would kind of suck if I walked away saying, man, I wish I'd bet more, or man, my team won, but the other guy didn't, my parlay didn't hit because I also bet on some guy to get a double and he only got a triple or whatever. So that I think is a little twisted for sure.
Have you heard from people that you interviewed or people in the industry about the book and their response to it?
Yeah, people in the industry, more like lower level people who spoke with me. Definitely people in sports and some lawmakers who were very appreciative of how it came out, but not the companies themselves in any sort of official capacity. And I'm still really hoping that the book makes enough noise that they have to address at least something in it, because I genuinely was wishful that they would feel like they wanted to tell their side of the story and respond to allegations that all sorts of people, including their own employees, make in the book. I'm still crossing my fingers that it gets to a level where they can't just, ignore it.
Are you happy with the marketing of it? Because again, like coming into this, like anything that I had read about it before I read it, or any of the reviews that I've read outside of mine really have been really sinking into like the devil has risen and we're all going to hell. Where I really don't think the book was written like that. Again, to be clear, has a position. And the position is, are we sure? Are we sure this is what we wanted? But it's not like a full-throated rebuke of the industry itself. And again, more than anything, it's at every turn I found it kind of correct. Like there was nothing that stood out to me like, man, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. One of my colleagues, Jess Wellman, she's at SBC America, she tweeted something out saying that this is required reading for people in the industry. And I really do agree.
No, I know what you were saying. Like, is it disappointing that certain headlines have gone way beyond the book in saying, this is evil, that's scourge that's happening in sports? I'm just so used to how headlines work and the kind of how hyperbolic they can be and oversimplified. Doesn't come as much of a surprise. I feel like I've had really good interviews though on a whole variety of mainstream and sports and gambling platforms that are a lot more nuanced. So that's encouraging. I'm also encouraged to sort of go back to your question about like the industry, just people like you and Jess and people who are not prone to like say the sky is falling, hearing that they, respect how I approach the book feels really good.
Yeah. Well, again, as someone who's been a reporter working in journalism for 30 years, I know the feeling of an editor saying you're going to be an expert on this by the end of the day. You could go write the story, And so I get it. It's not easy, for a general reporter to dive into this world. But oh my God. So, I mean, just like hair on fire. Like, how could this get past any editing desk? Like some of the stuff that I read, and your book was not that. And so that alone makes it worth it, I think, for anyone who's interested in the industry to pick it up and read it. Just the fact that I promise you, read it, listener, it's factual. Whether you agree with it or not, that's to you. But the idea that it's factual is very helpful. Do you have another book in the works and not outside of gambling? What's next?
I've had plenty of time to think about it. I've got to talk to my editor first and my publisher before I spill that to you. But yeah, I'm thinking.
When you got into the industry, just speaking curiously as a journalist myself, was books always like the result that you wanted or no?
No, it felt like something that I would maybe get to do way down the road in my career. It feels like I skipped ahead in some ways. But as I was reporting this at magazines and getting, pretty hefty word counts and the Post letting me write about it pretty frequently, I just felt like I was scratching the surface and like it needed a book. And a big part of why I felt that, and if I were maybe a more skilled reporter or had a staff job, maybe I would have had the time to accomplish this without a book. But such a big piece of it was cultivating sources in the industry or recent, people who worked there until recently. That just felt like it required all the time that I spent on a book to actually nail that. And I wasn't really getting that writing for papers and magazines. And sometimes when you tell people you're working on a book length project and they know it's not going to come out tomorrow, it's going to come out down the road, they're a little bit more willing to talk to you. So that helped too. But one of the main reasons why I was like, this necessitates a book. And even though I didn't think that I would get to do this at this point in my career, I got to go for it.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's, from one writer to another, I've been writing books for about 40 years, and every single one that I've written, the first, 10, 12 pages are awesome. And that's where I usually stop. It's such a, but my biggest problem, and so here, we'll make this a Jeff Edelstein therapy session for any writers listening, is that when I go back and read what I start, I'm like, oh, I got to rewrite. I have a hard time pushing forward.
Oh, man. Yeah, me too. Obsessive rereading, and it's so hard to get past a lead, let alone a chapter. So I'm with you. I could probably recite, my introduction from heart at this point. Just even after I finish it, I just can't stop rereading. It's a curse.
All right. The book is Everybody Loses by Danny Funt. Highly recommended to my listeners here. If you're in the industry, I do agree with Jess. It's required reading. And honestly, agree or disagree, the first 150 pages or so it just fucking cooks, man. It is just a fun walk down memory lane, just chock full of information.
That's awesome to hear. And I hope the second 150 are at least tolerable, Yeah.
They're tolerable. I would have made a few changes on my end, but that's fine. No. To be clear, the stuff that you write about, the negatives, we'll call them the negatives, is nothing that I haven't written about as someone who's on the pro side of it and saying, hey, maybe we need to take a longer look at what we're doing here and how it works. Anyway, Danny, thanks so much. I guess, who do you like? You got the Hawks or the Patriots? What are we doing here?
Seahawks, easy. I'm not, an odds maker. I thought, is it 4.5 right now? I thought at least, feels like they're going to just stroll through that game. We'll see.
You heard it here first. Danny, again, thanks so much, man.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it.